The rain was relentless that night, tapping against the window like 1,000 unanswered questions. I lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl upwards, mixing with the dim light of the street lamp outside. Another night, another case. This one trailing across continents, leaving bodies in its wake like debris after a storm. They called him the Serpent, a name that slithered through the shadows of Bangkok, Kathmandu, and Bombay. Charles Sobhraj, a man whose charm was as deadly as his hands. They say he could talk you into a trap with a smile, leaving you unaware until it was too late. The 1970s hippie trail, a path where dreamers searched for meaning in the East, became his hunting ground. The Serpent knew the terrain well, too well, and by the time the authorities caught up with him, the trail of blood stretched from the beaches of Thailand to the back streets of India. But the case didn't start in some sun-soaked paradise. It started in the dark, just like this. And once I started pulling at the thread, I realized this wasn't just a case of murder. This was a predator, a ghost, moving through the night. Act 1, a trail begins. The first reports came in quiet, almost unnoticed. Tourists gone missing along the South Asian hippie trail. It wasn't unusual. Young travelers, full of wanderlust and naivety, searching for enlightenment in places that promised peace and serenity. They'd disappear for weeks, sometimes months, only to reappear in some far-flung town, disheveled but no worse for wear. But this time, they didn't come back. It was the 1970s. Westerners, drawn to the mystique of the East, flocked to Asia in droves. Thailand, Nepal, India. Places where spirituality seemed to hang in the air like incense. They believed they'd find something here, something the West couldn't offer. But what they didn't realize was that danger had already found them. It was lurking in the form of a man who could smile at you, make you feel at ease, and then take everything you had, your money, your passport, your life. Charles Sobhraj didn't look like a killer. Handsome, suave, with a silver tongue that could charm even the most cautious traveler. He wasn't just any predator. He was a man who understood the human psyche, who knew that trust was the first step toward betrayal. And that's how he operated, befriending his victims, gaining their confidence, making them feel safe. He would offer a place to stay, a drink, a promise of adventure. But beneath that smooth exterior, there was only malice. The first known murders took place in Bangkok. A couple, found dead in their hotel room, stripped of their belongings. The scene was as cold as the man behind it. No struggle, no signs of panic. Just two bodies left like discarded puppets, their strings cut by a master manipulator. Sobhraj had struck, but his trail was just beginning, and the authorities weren't even close to catching on. I stood there in that Bangkok hotel, rain drumming against the windows, cigarette burning low in my hand. The scent of damp wood and fear filled the air. This case was the beginning of something dark, something that would haunt the streets of Asia for years to come. Act 2, the Serpent in the Shadows. If there was one thing Charles Sobhraj knew, it was how to disappear. Like smoke from a cigarette, he'd fade into the background just when you thought you had him. He wasn't just slipping through cracks, he was dancing through them, slipping out of police stations, countries, even jails, without leaving a trace. Authorities in Thailand, India, Nepal, they all tried to pin him down. But Sobhraj was a master of disguise, a man who could become someone else at the drop of a hat, and in this case, a stolen passport. His ability to manipulate was as dangerous as his hands. He'd charm you, make you think you were his closest friend, and then leave you with nothing. He traveled under different names, slipping between identities like a snake shedding its skin. By the time local authorities realized the man they were after had been right in front of them, Sobhraj had already moved on to the next city, the next victim. The press dubbed him the Bikini Killer, after several of his victims were found in little more than swimwear, their bodies abandoned like yesterday's news. They were women mostly, travelers who trusted the wrong man. Sobhraj would drug them, leaving them vulnerable and helpless before he took what he wanted, sometimes their lives. The bodies were found on beaches, washed up or discarded in the dense underbrush, their last moments spent in the company of a man who smiled as he sealed their fate. I stood over the photographs, crime scenes that blurred together from Thailand to India to Nepal, scattered clues, each one pointing to something far bigger, but none strong enough to piece together a full picture. One girl dead on a Thai beach, another found in a cramped Kathmandu hotel room, a French tourist left lifeless in a rundown alley in Bombay. All of them connected by one thing: the Serpent. He moved in the shadows, but those shadows were starting to take form. The unease settled deep in my gut. This wasn't just a killer we were chasing. This was a ghost. A man who knew every loophole, every back door, and every weakness in the system. The streets of Bangkok, the beaches of Pattaya, the dark alleys of Kathmandu, they all bore his mark. But the hardest part wasn't tracking him down. It was knowing that even if we caught him, he'd likely slip away again, laughing as he vanished into the night. And that's what made Charles Sobhraj different. He wasn't just hiding. He was playing a game that kept everyone in the dark, and he was always 2 steps ahead. Act 3. A trail of blood. The bodies kept piling up. Thailand, Nepal, India. Each new murder leaving a fresh stain on the map, like blood droplets tracing a path only Sobhraj could see. The press followed the case with morbid fascination, but the authorities, well, they scrambled. Different countries, different jurisdictions, each chasing after a killer who knew how to slip past their walls of bureaucracy as easily as he slipped past their handcuffs. Every time a new body was found, it felt like a message. Not to the victims, not to their families, but to the world, to us. It was as if Sobhraj was taunting the law, leaving breadcrumbs soaked in blood from one country to the next, daring anyone to catch up. But that's the thing about a trail of blood. It's never as simple as following it. By the time you found the source, the damage is done. The break came in India, of all places. Sobhraj had grown bolder, or maybe more reckless. He poisoned a group of tourists, hoping to knock them out, steal what they had, and leave before anyone could connect the dots. But something went wrong. One of them survived, and Sobhraj, for the first time in years, was caught. The snake was finally in a cage, or so it seemed. The Indian authorities had him, but Sobhraj's talent for manipulation wasn't limited to unsuspecting tourists. He worked the system, turning guards, bribing officials, using every ounce of charm and deceit he had to make his life behind bars as comfortable as possible. He became more of a celebrity than a prisoner, giving interviews, smiling for the cameras, as if prison was just another part of the game he'd been playing all along. Severe punishment never came. India held on to him, sure, but justice, that was something more elusive. Incompetence ran deep in the local law enforcement, and Sobhraj knew how to exploit every weakness. Countries bickered over jurisdiction, legalities got tangled in the web of international law, and all the while, the Serpent bided his time. That trail of blood, it wasn't just leading to Sobhraj, it was leading to the failures of a system too fractured, too disjointed, to catch a man who understood how to play it better than they ever could. In the end, it wasn't just Sobhraj that slipped through the cracks. It was justice itself. I could feel it then, standing there in the crowded streets of New Delhi, watching as the world seemed to move on without realizing the trail of bodies that led here. A trail of blood that stretched across years, across borders, one that might never truly end. Act 4. The Return of the Serpent, 1997. After 2 decades behind bars, the Serpent was set free. India let him walk. Most men would have taken the opportunity to disappear for good, to fade into the shadows where they belonged. Not Sobhraj. He wasn't like most men. There was something about him, something that wouldn't let him stay hidden, even if he wanted to. Maybe it was his ego. Maybe the hunger for infamy. Or maybe, after all those years of playing the game, he needed to come back to the place where it all began. It didn't make sense. After years of evading capture, charming his way out of justice and slipping through every loophole the world could throw at him, why return to Nepal? Why go back to the place that still remembered him? The place where his crimes were burned into the earth. It was 2003 when the news hit. Charles Sobhraj was in Kathmandu, strolling the streets as if he hadn't left a trail of bodies behind. It didn't take long for the authorities to catch up this time. A face like his, he couldn't hide from that. Arrested again, this time for the murder of 2 tourists back in the 70s. I found myself wondering if he wanted to be caught. Like a moth circling the flame, he came back to the scene of his crimes, almost as if he was haunted by them. Or maybe he just wanted to remind the world that he hadn't disappeared, that the serpent was still out there, coiled and ready to strike. Sobhraj never showed remorse. Even when they threw him back in prison, he wore that same crooked smile. He was an enigma, more predator than man, more ghost than flesh. But even ghosts have places they're drawn to, and for Sobhraj, that place was Nepal. The predator had returned to his hunting ground, as if the streets of Kathmandu were whispering his name, calling him back. As I closed the file on Charles Sobhraj, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. For men like him, there's always another chapter, another game to play. He was behind bars, sure, but somehow it felt like the serpent was still out there, slithering in the shadows, waiting for the world to forget, just long enough for him to strike again.